I'm sure that over the past few years, most of us have had relationships destroyed that were previously good. But how much of that destruction in Cindy's life was due to her own behavior and intolerance?
Why don't you tolerate my intolerance? On the one hand, you have a person that, doesn't think trans people exist or should exist. And on the other hand, you have the person who agrees with medical and scientific consensus that trans people do exist and that trans healthcare actually doesn't hurt them. These are not the same, man. And I don't have to be tolerant of the people that don't think that trans people should exist, or that women should be second-class citizens, or that black people should be second class. I don't have to tolerate that. In fact, it is a good thing to be intolerant to the view of queer people should not have equal rights. Queer people should not be oppressed. I am intolerant to those views because those views lead to the harm of people. Perhaps not interpersonally by one person going up to another and punching them, but at a systemic level through legislation when those people go and vote for politicians who push bigoted legislation. So apparently it's been about 8 months since we've seen a video from this person. Think Before You Sleep, a supposed centrist, quote unquote, that has some interesting opinions, has some interesting views, especially for a centrist. This Jubilee video, I remember watching, I think Hassan reacted to it. This is a Jubilee video, conservative teens versus liberal parents. The video here, however, reacting to it, or I guess providing commentary on it, woke Karen spreads misinformation. And the thumbnail has this person on the middle right in it. And what I remember is that this person was very based and was actually calling out the conservatives on the panel for a lot of their misunderstandings, let's say, about reality and factual data. But, it is what it is. So 8 months ago, I reacted to when indoctrinated teens become adults or something like that by TBYS. 8 months ago, and I still get people coming at me in my comments, fans of his or whatever. A lot of them are big fans of saying that trans people don't exist and also calling me a man or something, which doesn't do anything to me. But frankly, a centrist channel having so many transphobes, at least the ones willing to come to my audience, makes me wonder. I feel like to be a centrist, your take would be, oh, well, seems like trans people exist. I mean, the medical and scientific consensus on the matter says that trans people exist. Most, you could imagine, but not all, will experience gender dysphoria. And usually the way that you would go about helping those people with that gender dysphoria would be HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and potentially even puberty blockers for trans youth so that they can, in conjunction with the guidance of medical and mental health professionals, as well as their parents, figure out if they're trans, put their puberty on hold for a little bit until they figure that out. And then if they are trans, they go on HRT and further that along, or they get off it and they just go through a later puberty like cis kids who have a precocious puberty, can wait a little bit until they go on it, or even people who naturally have late puberties and it doesn't really do much. The studies that we've seen on puberty blockers suggest that there are virtually zero negative side effects to puberty blockers in trans youth, and it is very helpful for the medical professionals interfacing with the child to figure out if that child is actually trans and to go forward from there and see what the best practices are, all of which are pro-trans, and there will be an attempt to contradict them in this here video from some of the comments I looked at to see if this was a video worth watching. So let's find out. Woke Karen spreads misinformation. Let's see what's up from TBYS.
Frightening to me is that you're equating some minor inconveniences in your privileged life to
why would you assume my life is privileged?
Unsupported,
but why would you assume my life is privileged, though? You don't know my life. I don't say that about you. Why would you assume my life is privileged?
I'm privileged.
Okay,
oh my god, the Uno reverse card, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap card. I was gonna say, I would call her privileged, because it's likely that she is being white. Now, I don't know. It's possible that she's at a disadvantage when it comes to her class status or socioeconomic status. She could be a disadvantage there. If she's poor, potentially, because white people can be poor, under capitalism especially, that's a very likely thing to happen. You're likely to have a slight edge when it comes to beating out black and brown people and other marginalized identities when it comes to your socioeconomic status. At least that's what the statistics show. But anyway.
Why would you assume my life is privileged?
For one, you're a man.
I love how these people...
It's true. It's true. As a man in society, not always, and I mean all men are going to be rich and famous and have all this money and all this capital. However, as a man in society, you have a lot of privileges for being a man. That is true. But like I say, it doesn't mean every man suddenly becomes Jeff Bezos, and not everybody all of a sudden becomes Elon Musk, but you do get a little bit of help. It's not perfect. It's not silver bullet to have a perfect life, but it exists. And you're denying reality to suggest it doesn't. But here we go.
Okay,
Let's
that's
see what
fine.
he has to say.
Why would you assume my life is privileged?
For one, you're a man.
I love how these people always miss the irony of how sexist they are. A lady walks into a dark...
I'm sorry. I forgot how this dude sounded. That's my bad. Good luck out there. What are we talking about
I love how
here?
these people always miss the irony of how sexist they are.
Okay.
A lady walks into
Sexist
a
for
dark room
what?
to debate someone who is probably half her age, knows pretty much nothing about him, immediately says he's had it easy because he's a man.
Did she say he had it easy? If she did, I think that's silly to assume, and I would agree with that. But I also don't disagree that men do have systemic advantages over women in society, generally speaking.
I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's sexist. Also, notice how she had to bring up his sex but not his race because she is white and he's a POC. Very prejudiced of her.
You know, most people...
Okay, so much for the tolerant left right in the beginning. What an argument, man. How exciting. What a stalwart defense of men here in this engagement. What if I told you that people of color can still have some privileges in their life if they happen to be, one, potentially anyway, men, though obviously it's not the silver bullet. You're more likely to have more privileges for being a man if you're white, but it is still possible for men to have a certain amount of privilege over women as a black or brown person. Number two, if they were born to a wealthy family. Now, of course, we're probably not going to talk too much about class in this video, except to talk about how, oh, well, you say men are privileged, you say white people are privileged. Well, what about poor white people in trailer parks? Because, we don't actually care about helping people. We don't care about attacking the systems that make it so that poor people exist to begin with and make it so that people live in poverty to begin with, which is a bad thing, and I don't think should happen. I'm saying some crazy stuff here, but frankly, I think poverty, not good. We should make sure everybody has basic necessities covered, and poverty, as it exists in America, does not allow for them. Some crazy things coming out of my mouth here, but anyway.
You know, most people commit suicide are men. Most people who work in dangerous workplaces are men. Most people who fight in war are men.
And who set that system up?
True.
Did you like that little mic drop moment she had?
Why do you say a mic drop moment? It cut, that was the editors of Jubilee who cut it in that way, right? Like, it's not like it was a mic drop moment, but it's actually true. I don't know how you can blame women for any supposed advantages you think they have in society if the system is literally built by powerful men. The systems that we live under, while they have been updated a little bit over time, certainly not updated enough in my opinion, were built by men. Literally, these systems were built when women were considered property of their husbands and fathers. So clearly, women did not have a heavy hand to play in the creation of the system that we live in, and therefore it is unlikely that there is this massive amount of influence that women have had to give men this uneven hand that they're being dealt, as you suggest, right? Like, men being the more likely ones to commit suicide is not because, like, the world is harder for men or whatever. It's because they're more likely to choose options that are more lethal, like firearms. There have been studies that have shown that men are more likely to opt for options that are actually more lethal, like firearms, like a variety of other methods, whereas women are more likely to go for less violent options, like trying to overdose on purpose and things like that. So they have less successes, but the people who are more likely to succeed in their attempt and their life, unfortunately, are men because of that. Whose fault is that? Well, I don't think it's the women. I don't think it's women's fault that's the problem. And I don't think it's men's fault either, though statistically it is more likely that men are the ones making these decisions. It is a systemic problem, and it can be fixed at a systemic level. Anyway, let's see what he has to say.
And no, it wasn't men who set that system up. When it comes to things like war, it was a bunch of sociopathic assholes who care more about money and power than the well-being of other people. So
capitalists. So capital owners and their influence over the politicians, the legislators, the lawmakers, whose job it is to legislate, to create policy for the public, right? Those capital owners and the influence that they had over the politicians led to systems being built to benefit the ultra wealthy, to benefit men, to benefit specifically white people, because when this country was founded, black people were literally slaves and were not even considered human. So yeah, I will agree, TBYS, it was the capitalists, the capital owners, and the politicians that they influence with their money and charitable donations to their campaigns that crafted all of the legislation that led to a lot of this. And we can undo it. Hell yeah.
It's sexist to accuse an entire group of people of a crime just because a few people who happen to be the same sex did something bad.
Yeah, but the thing is that statistically, it is overwhelmingly likely that it was men who were those capital owners who influenced those politicians, and it was men who were those politicians who crafted that legislation and policy that disadvantaged women and people of color and disabled people, and the list goes on, right? Of my woke accolades that I could talk about. It is statistically likely that that was a man, and those policies were crafted to benefit men as well. To the point where even if you were not a capital owner, you were not one of the people that was in a position of power to do this, you were still benefiting from it in some way, so long as you were not very poor. So, like, I agree that it is foolish to suggest that, oh, if you're a man, well, you have some guilt. You have a part to play in this negative circumstance that disadvantages those disadvantaged groups. I think that's silly. I think that's a liberal talking point, and I also think it's one that conservatives kind of talk about too, just in a different way. However, that is not my point of view. And I don't know, I don't remember too much about the video, unfortunately, for woke Karen and her points on it, nor do we know the full context of the video because Jubilee cuts it up for the sake of time and whatnot. So, could be that she's a stinky liberal and I don't like her. But a lot of the things that she was saying seem to be accurate. So I'll call out what isn't, I guess.
Also, many of those sociopaths include women. Look up Indira Gandhi. Look up Wu Zetian. By the way, calling someone privileged
from 690
is not.
Wait, when is
up
this
Indira
one?
Gandhi.
This is 1984. I guess you could say, you know, Margaret Thatcher, bit of a sociopath, not a big fan, not a bit good, you know. I would certainly stick a wooden stake, put some garlic around her neck, you know what I mean? So that's true. That said, Margaret Thatcher becoming the prime minister or whatever in the UK, bruv, was considered a glass ceiling shattering moment for feminism to dumbasses when it actually wasn't. Because her policies, especially when it came to economics, were dreadful. So I will agree. Call me crazy. I think it is possible that women in positions of power can do bad things with that power. That's possible. However, until I see the women in these positions of power getting to such a point where they're trying to push for and institute policies that advantage women over men, I'm not going to care too much. I'm just going to call them pieces of shit like I do Thatcher and move on. Because to suggest that not all men are responsible for the negative things that men in positions of power did, you cannot blame all women for things that Indira Gandhi or Thatcher did, even though they were women. Like, I don't know what we're talking about here. This is just like a whataboutism, essentially. Like, we're looking at individual actors and pitting them against other individual actors, where I'm talking about systemic problems. So, like, we're just not having the same conversation here. TBYS is having, like, Babby's first political takes that you would talk about on, like, your Xbox calls or, like, your CSGO lobbies. And I'm up here just way more advanced than that slog down here. That said, CSGO is pretty fucking pog. And it's certainly better than Valorant, though Valorant has cooler character designs, so there you go.
By the way, calling someone privileged is not an argument. Calling someone a name is
well, also, bringing up random-ass women of the past is not an argument when you're trying to what about these women when we're talking about, like, specific men that had positions of power, right? Like, it's also not an argument. Talking about this person, you know, misunderstanding how the intersection of privileges and oppression can affect a person by suggesting that, oh, well, this person, just because he's a man, but also a person of color, well, then certainly he has a worse hand at it than this white woman. It's possible, but I don't give a shit because we're not really talking about individual actors, at least I'm not trying to.
Anyway, for those of you who don't know, this is Jubilee's middle ground.
Dog shit program, by the way. It seems to have a right-leaning bias. I don't know what he's about to say, but it seems to have a right-leaning bias, at least in the way that they lay out a lot of the questions. If we look at the more recent Jubilee video that I reacted to here, do trans women understand womanhood better than conservatives? This was a trans women versus conservative women panel. Almost all of the questions, they were framed in such a way that seemed to lean toward the right. Like, oh, are trans women a danger to women or something like that, right? Almost all the questions were. And the way that these are set up is also interesting. So usually on Jubilee panels, you'll get like content creators together because that's just networking. Jubilee is going to look for content creators before they look at random average Joes off the street because you can get the content creators that are on the platform to watch the Jubilee video and therefore keep the viewers going up. That's called being a content creation platform, right? We understand that. However, it seems like a lot of the time we're getting people like that are affiliated with PragerU on the conservative side of things. And on the left-wing, I guess, side of things, you're getting a lot of people that are literally just random content creators that don't have that kind of like capital backing from something like PragerU, et cetera, et cetera. So that's also interesting to look at. But I mean, it's also possible that maybe some people get money from like Media Mat. I don't fucking know what's going on here. There really aren't a lot of super wealthy leftist donors out there to a lot of content creators and whatnot. So like there is for the right. It's hard for me to pull names out of that here.
Is a left-leaning channel that uses this.
It is a left-leaning channel. Really? They're trying to get the middle ground, man. How is it left-leaning? It's a left-leaning channel. All right, I kind of want to look now. I kind of want to look at these questions. Let's see. All right, so luckily, these are chaptered out for all the questions. First question we get is, so this is not the way it's directly phrased, but they're saying, is the transgender movement indoctrinating our youth? That framing is inherently right-wing because it is the right-wing position that the transgender movement, quote-unquote, is indoctrinating our youth, quote-unquote. You could format this question when it comes to the transgender movement and its effects on the youth in a variety of different ways. But for whatever reason, it's framed in this way. It could be that this is a common talking point on the right, and therefore, because of SEO or whatever, people are more likely to find this video through looking that question up or something like that. It could be that. They could also just be looking for the vitriol, but that is a right-leaning question, the way that it is framed. It seems to start the right-wingers, the conservatives on the panel, off on a better foot. Because like, you have to be defensive if you're pro-trans in this question, if you're disagreeing with this question, but you can be offensive if you're agreeing with the question, which the conservatives will. So you're already starting off on a good foot, especially in optics, where being on the offense is usually going to look better. Number 2, I am comfortable sharing bathrooms with the other side. That's a fine question. Now, of course, this is also talking about, right-wing politics, because usually it is going to be the case that right-wingers are not comfortable sharing bathrooms with trans women. Usually cis women will not be if they're conservative. Most people who go to bathrooms, though, just go there, do their business, and leave. It's usually not a whole lot going on in there, and if a man wanted to pretend to be a woman or whatever, to go into a room to assault someone, he probably won't pretend to be a woman. He would probably just do it anyway, because he's already going to be committing a more grave crime, assault, than entering the women's restroom when he's not supposed to. So, doesn't seem to happen too much. And whenever it does happen, it seems to be cis men that are right-wing. But anyway. The ability to give birth is a woman's strength. This is also a right-wing talking point. Of course, you have to see if you agree or disagree with it. Well, conservatives will say that. Left-leaning people or liberals might say that, well, if you can give birth, that's super cool. But if you can't, then, it's also fine. We should do what we can to support you, like surrogacy or whatever else, right? Trans women should be allowed to compete in women's sports. This one is a whole fucking bag of worms. There is a really nuanced conversation to be had here. Unfortunately, conservatives are usually not having that nuanced conversation, though. And they're usually just trying to ban all trans people from sporting events, which is very cringe. Gender dysphoria is real. Well, the medical consensus on the issue is that it is. I don't know how you could disagree with that. I have been sexually harassed, and that's just like a general personal question, which all sides will agree yes to, because rates of harassment and abuse against trans people, specifically trans feminine people, is very high, unfortunately. So, I don't know how you call it left-leaning. See if we buttress this point in any way.
Take two disagreeing parties, give them a few prompts, and see if they can come to an understanding or find some respect for each other. Very wholesome. But one of the pet peeves that I have for these kinds of discussions is that very often there are people who run on pretty much zero factually accurate information.
Yeah, I hate that too. It's usually the conservatives, though. Like in this video where Blossom, I think that was her name, who was asking one of the conservative people, the anti-trans people, do you have any studies to support XYZ? And they didn't. So, I mean, the conservatives came up empty on that one. No factual basis to the argument. Of course, if you're going to disagree with medical and scientific consensus on an issue, you're probably not going to be on the best foot. Artemy is being an asshole. Give me a second. God, I hate this guy's voice. Yeah, well, not much you could do about that. That's actually not true. There is some vocal training that you can do, but you can only do so much. Anyway, I'm allergic to cats. So I'm allergic to Artemy, and he really likes trying to get into the drawer that my bedding is kept in, because he knows how to open it, and obviously I cannot have his allergens all over the stuff that I spend 7 to 9 hours of my life in, my bedding, but he does it anyway, because he's an asshole. So I had to kick him out. Anyway.
Yet have these strong beliefs and are very forceful about their opinions. to the point where I question the validity of the information of anyone who acts with as much hostility as this Facebook mom does in this video.
So what's interesting about that is that in the most recent Jubilee video that we were just talking about, trans versus conservative women, the conservative side gets fact-checked like 3 or 4 times by Jubilee with factual information. So that's interesting. Something to think about, I guess, instead of just flatly believing what TBYS has to say about it.
It seems like the people who have the wrong information always have to be very pushy to get you to believe what they do, because if you actually did any research, you would easily figure out that they were wrong. And
also interesting that conservatives lead literally every single culture war in this country that can be easily falsifiable, but all of them push it as hard as they can so that it becomes the party line, and people don't actually look into it because they're hearing so many people talk about it. Like how, you know, M&Ms are too woke, or how Mr. Potato Head being just Potato Head is somehow a threat to your children or something like that. You know, just random stuff like that. You know, the fact that conservatives in this country completely focus on shit that is completely inconsequential to most normal people in order to avoid actual conversations about policy, interesting.
This is not a matter of opinion. These are statements of fact that she makes. One of the prompts they responded to was, owning a gun is a basic human right. Do you
Sure, I agree with that. I agree that the right to bear arms is pretty poggers. However, I do not think that doing nothing to regulate firearms is a good idea. I support wait times for gun purchases, which have shown to be helpful in decreasing the amounts of violent acts that are committed. Because if a person has enough time, because they have to wait to procure their firearm, to think about do they want to go through with this violent act, they are less likely to go through with it, rather than it being, you know, a spur of passion. They just go to their local Walmart, buy a gun, and then shoot people up, right? So I support those wait times. I also support red flag laws, specifically targeting domestic abuse history, because it seems like almost every time that we look into another mass shooting or mass incident that happens, the person perpetrating it, which is overwhelmingly going to be a man, also seems to have a history of domestic violence, to the tune of about 60%, I believe. So I support red flag laws that would be like, oh, well, if you have a history of domestic violence, you probably shouldn't have access to a firearm because it seems like you are more likely to do mass incidents with it. I think that is a fairly centrist take. The idea that law-abiding citizens should be able to own firearms for self-defense or for sport, if you're into target practice or whatever, that's fine. I advocate for responsible firearm ownership, which begins before you even buy the damn thing, if you understand yourself to be, you know, comfortable enough to have one. But anyway, what were we saying? Sorry.
One of the prompts they responded to was, owning a gun is a basic human right. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Let's start with a statement of fact that she makes that can easily be fact-checked.
Don't want automatic rifles. Against that. Nobody needs them. The majority of people who die by gunshot are women in a domestic violence situation.
Okay, Cindy. That's her name, by the way. But Cindy,
I'm sorry. I don't know that we could be making fun of people's names being Cindy or whatever, which is a personal attack and not an argument, while sounding the way that you do, TBYS. I'm not sure we should be making personal attacks when you sound the way that you do. I'm just gonna say, I'm just putting it out there.
literally have never even done a 5-second Google search on this information, and you obviously don't fact-check any of the pundits or the newspapers that you get your info from. This is a pretty well-known statistic. The majority of gun deaths are suicide, and as that kid said earlier, most suicides are men.
So, okay, we're probably misspeaking. We're probably going to be talking then about, at least what I assume she's talking about, is not just firearm-related deaths wholesale, but rather murders, would be my guess. Because like I say, 60% of the time that we have one of these incidents happen, the person has a history of domestic violence. So I'm likely to guess that it is likely that it's to do with murders, and then that it's going to be likely that it's going to be related to a domestic incident.
Of course, domestic violence against women is bad. Men die by firearms way more than women do. And
yeah, okay, but if we're talking about women in this instance, we're talking about as a result of domestic violence. I think that you could be charitable there and be like, oh, well, she probably misspoke. She was probably talking about the domestic violence thing.
Speaking of firearms, stuff like this is what I'm talking about.
Oh boy.
I actually debated whether or not I was going to sit down because I do believe people have the right to bear arms. I do.
Okay. I'm with you.
My issue is what kind of arms they're bearing.
Okay, I'm also with you. I will go out on a stretch of a leg right here and say that I do not think that the individual citizen should have a right to a nuclear warhead. Now, Tim Pool disagrees with me.
I believe an individual citizen in this country has a right to own a nuclear warhead.
Because he actually does believe that. I don't. Frankly, it's unfortunate that nuclear weapons were ever developed to begin with, but I will say that the individual citizen probably shouldn't have access to a nuclear warhead considering the amount of damage they could do with it. Much the same way that there are a variety of other things that you might not want to allow citizens to easily get. Now, the degree to which you're willing to do gun bans or whatever is up to you. I'm not the biggest fan of gun bans. You'll notice that when I talked about good gun regulation, I'm talking about wait times for gun purchases and red flag laws and stuff like that. I'm not really a big fan of banning guns. It seems like that doesn't really help the situation very much because you could just get the gun anyway because we live in America. There are more guns than there are people. It just seems to be a band-aid solution that liberals will propose because they're scared of guns and think an AR-15 stands for assault rifle and also don't understand that most pistols are, semi-automatic. So, like, if there's liberals on this panel, I'll probably disagree with a lot of what they're going to say on guns.
People should get to go hunt, but do you need a semi-automatic rifle to do that?
Okay, so there you go. So I think the big problem here is that liberals, generally speaking, don't know a lot about guns. They're conflating semi-automatic with fully automatic, right? Unless they're suggesting that to go hunting, you should be only using like a bolt-action rifle or something like that. But it seems like, generally speaking, liberals will conflate semi-automatic with fully automatic. But even a standard Glock is going to be semi-automatic. So if that part of the classification is your problem, then you just are not aware of what you're talking about.
I'll tell you about personally, I'm afraid of guns personally myself.
That's also a big thing, yeah. Liberals are afraid of guns, they don't have a respect for them. Not a respect in that you're an ammo-sexual and you want to fuck a gun, but in a respect in that you understand that that's a dangerous weapon and you need to have respect for it in order to, 1, understand how it works, 2, defend yourself against it, 3, use it, right? So.
We do. We should be allowed to use tools that are effective, especially when it comes to consideration of the animal and creating as painless of an experience as possible. But more importantly, I
think usually when it comes to the painless experience of the animal is reliant on the actual skill of the hunter so that you can hit the correct points to make it the most painless death possible, which I believe theoretically you could do with a bow and arrow. But obviously, a bow and arrow is going to require more skill than aiming a firearm. Both do require a fair amount of skill, though.
Even know what a semi-automatic rifle is? Because literally, every time I've talked to someone who says what she did, they can't tell me what that term means, or they describe it incorrectly.
Yeah.
And it causes them to create dumb arguments because they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, but the cool thing about that is I understand the difference, and I also agree that there are good regulations you could put on firearms. I don't know TBYS's stance on guns. I don't know if he's for, like, dissolving all regulations against them, because that would be absurd to me. I don't know. I guess maybe we'll find out.
For example,
if we actually talk about any of our own positions and not just, vaguely gesture at the hypocrisy of the people on the panel on this Jubilee thing you're talking about.
I've heard multiple people in my lifetime say, I think all semi-automatics should be banned, but handguns are fine.
Yeah, but handguns are, we understand.
If you don't know why that statement is dumb, then go look up the definition of semi-automatic. I am tired of people doing no research and then acting like they are the smartest people in the world.
Liberals are dumb on guns, I agree.
Tell these people are just listening to propaganda and these aren't their own thoughts because they literally can't define anything and they all repeat the same exact lines. All they know is...
They can't... Let's hear that again, I'm sorry.
Literally can't define anything and they all repeat the same exact lines.
All repeat the same exact lines. I don't know, man. Seems like both sides of the aisle are guilty of that sin. I'm just saying. Conservatives don't seem to know a lot about gender identity, sexuality. They don't seem to know a lot about systemic racism. And they just seem to parrot a lot of talking points. I don't know. Maybe these are just differing ways that each side of the spectrum are wrong, right?
All they know is, this thing is really bad because the TV person said so, and I'm angry and scared. This kind of thing really shines in the next segment with the Facebook.
Right-wingers are never guilty of this, by the way. Right-wingers never done this. Donald Trump, who famously said he loves the uneducated because they're more likely to be willing to vote for him. Famously, right-wingers have never been guilty of this.
Book mom Cindy.
Not being an LGBTQ plus ally makes someone a bad person.
Holy, that's actually a question that's framed in a humanitarian way. not being an LGBTQ plus ally makes someone a bad person. I agree. Because there has been no substantive data to suggest that LGBTQ plus people are a threat to anybody. Therefore, not being an ally to them seems to just harm them, right? Not being an ally and not pushing for the liberation of queer people broadly from the oppressions that they may face, which are many, seems to be a good thing if you don't want humans to suffer. Because there have been no studies to suggest that queer people are a threat to anybody.
I would question someone's empathy.
That's it.
And their awareness of the other people around them, because I guarantee you know someone that's
Absolutely.
LGBTQ.
And their environment.
Right.
I think
Wait, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that response? The answer to not being an LGBTQ plus ally makes someone a bad person. She says, well, I would question their ability to empathize with their fellow human being, which it seems like empathy is one of the major, bedrocks of human civilization, being able to care about people that are not yourself, understand what they're going through, and wanting to potentially even turn that into action and help them, right? Seems to be a thing that has allowed humans to, one of the things that has allowed humans to get to the position that they're in right now as a species. I mean, I'm just saying. So questioning your ability to empathize with people, empathy seems to be a good thing, seems to be helpful for people to make the world a better place. Okay.
We question someone's empathy.
That's right.
And their awareness of the other people around them.
And their awareness of the other people around them, right? Because if you understand that there have been no substantive studies to show that queer people existing has any negative effect on anybody, then to suggest that they should be oppressed or continue to be oppressed because they already are, is foolish. And I would say that harming somebody for no reason, which you would be doing in that instance, makes you a bad person. Hope that helped. How is she wrong here?
Because I guarantee you know someone that's
Absolutely.
LGBTQ.
And their
And
environment.
it is incredibly likely that you have probably known somebody or come into contact with somebody who is in the LGBTQIA plus community, right? And it is unlikely, aside from, humans just being assholes sometimes, that it was a negative thing. Like, they didn't, fucking wololo you and turn you queer when you're not or whatever. You might not even known they were queer.
I think woke people really mess this stuff up, and I think they have a big
Oh,
problem
boy.
understanding
Let's
the
go.
meaning of tolerance versus
Woke people.
acceptance, which is apparent because as a group, they're very intolerant.
So much for the tolerant left from 2 months ago, dude. These memes, man. We are recycling old memes. And I'm supposed to believe meme magic is real, man.
I don't agree with your opinion or your lifestyle choices, but I'll still treat you like a human being. For example, you might not agree with someone's opinion on abortion, but that doesn't mean you get to treat them like crap.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by treat them like crap. Because I don't know that, just because somebody is, anti-abortion doesn't mean that, I'm suddenly gonna, key their car. That's ridiculous. I'm going to try to make sure that they don't have any political power to institute policies that would restrict abortion to other people, sure, by voting, by trying to get people to canvass for politicians that are pro-choice, that kind of stuff. Going to try to disempower that bad viewpoint through the electoral system, et cetera, right? I think it'd be foolish to, do bad to somebody because of that stance. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. Also, let me see. Let me hear this again.
For example, you might not agree with someone's opinion on abortion, but that doesn't mean you get to treat them like crap.
Sure.
Acceptance, or being an ally, means you agree with the person. Personally, I think it's lower empathy to only understand acceptance and not tolerance, because it's easy to treat people well if you already agree with them.
What? What are we talking about, man? Let me step back in this conversation and try to unpack a little bit of this, all right? I think the major problem that people would diagnose when it comes to those that are, say, anti-abortion, like the example that he gave, would be that to be anti-abortion, personally, is whatever. If you don't want to get an abortion, that's on you. That's your individual liberty. If you want to follow through with a pregnancy, go for it. I don't give a fuck. However, if you take that view and then bring it into the political sphere and vote for a politician, or if you're a politician yourself and try to legislate away other people's abilities to attain that abortion and therefore restrict their bodily autonomy and their individual liberty as human beings, that's a problem for me. And that's what a lot of anti-abortion people do. So I don't give a shit about this person personally. I'm not going to key their car because they're anti-abortion. However, if they go out and vote to restrict the bodily autonomy of other people, to restrict the individual liberty of other people, well, then I'm going to have a problem with that because you're causing suffering to people for no reason. Much the same way that if you're not an ally to, if you do not support the liberation of the LGBTQIA plus community from the oppressions that they face, personally, if you hate gay people, I think you're kind of a shitty person. I don't give a fuck. However, if you bring that into the political realm and you vote for politicians that say, I don't know, are trying to make being trans illegal by vague bans against so-called drag performances or whatever, or are trying to restrict through bureaucratic means the medication and treatments that a lot of trans people will get, like HRT, at the state level, stop them from doing that, essentially getting rid of the trans people because they can no longer be medically trans, that's a problem for me. I'm gonna have a problem with that because you are doing harm to people using those views. That's the difference, right? On the one hand, you got a thought. On the other hand, you have action. The action part is the more important part to me. I don't give a shit about your personal thoughts or feelings.
And it's not moral of those two to say you're a bad person because you don't have the same beliefs.
Yeah, it's not that you're a bad person because you don't have the same beliefs. It's what you do with those beliefs. That's where you become a bad person. Now, I said before that you might be a shit person, and that I think that when I'm saying you're a shit person, I think essentially what Cindy said, that yeah, you probably do not have enough empathy. You might struggle with empathy with your fellow human being, and your misunderstandings of the queer community might make you more likely to support systemic harm to them, like voting in politicians that are going to institute anti-trans laws. I think that would make you a bad person. And if you have those beliefs, you're more likely to do the bad action. So I'm likely to assume that that's the case, and therefore, you're kind of an asshole. Not a big fan.
With that said, here's an LGBT conservative kid who apparently has a more mature take than the Facebook mom.
What I really like about this is that we're never going to get any of TBYS's actual opinions on any topic. It's incredibly rare that in these 5 minutes and 35 seconds, you could come across a potential thing that would sound like one of his opinions. He just talks about what the other people are talking about and vaguely gestures at any hypocrisy that he might see them as having, right? Whereas in this entire video, because I'm not a coward, I've told you my beliefs. I believe in the liberation of queer people from the oppressions that they face. I believe in the liberation of black and brown people from the oppressions that they face, from women, the oppressions that they face, and yes, even men, from the oppressions that they face on the basis of class, especially if they're white, right? Because that's going to be the major oppression that they face is on class. I am willing to tell you what I believe, my positions on guns and gun regulations that I think would be helpful, that studies have suggested would be helpful. But TBYS doesn't seem to give a shit about actually giving his opinions. It might be because maybe he doesn't have enough faith in his opinions or something. I don't know.
I can provide a unique perspective on this because I'm actually bisexual. So I think not being an ally, as long as you're not harming people, you're not harassing people, you're not posting on social media that these people suck, then I don't think you're a bad person.
So if you're not interpersonally bigoted against queer people, this person does not have a problem. This bisexual conservative has no problem with you. I would then ask this bisexual conservative, well, what if they do harm to people through voting in politicians that institute anti-queer legislation? Because that would then harm those queer people. It wouldn't be a direct interpersonal kind of bigotry, but it would be a systemic kind of bigotry, which frankly I think is worse. What then? Because that is often going to be the case. Anti-queer people are likely to vote for anti-queer politicians, which are likely to try to institute anti-queer legislation, which leads to the harm of people for no reason, except for their bigoted beliefs. That's the problem.
You don't have to agree with someone's choices to be tolerant, but I think that idea gets skipped over a lot on the left, just like it was skipped over back in the day when conservatives were more prejudiced on this issue 30 years ago, because those people believed things that were wildly untrue. Now
They still do, though. I know we like to pretend that conservatives are more progressive on the issue. The only reason that they are is because they've been legally forced to be, through the codification of gay marriage as a right, which is currently trying to be undone by the conservative Supreme Court. They're trying to roll that progress back. The main reason why gay people are not the biggest target, or at least they weren't for a while, of the conservatives was because of that legal framework that was seen as a major cultural win for queer rights, which it was, though it didn't go far enough, of course, because it's easily undone if you get enough high priests in the Supreme Court to undo it, right? So the idea that conservatives have changed at all is absurd. And you can tell very easily by the so-called anti-groomer rhetoric, where they essentially just call, with no evidence, every single queer person and their allies PDF files, with no evidence, just call them that, simply because of their identity or the fact that they are in favor of the liberation of queer people, are allies to it, but are heterosexual and cisgender themselves. So, like, it seems like it's actually kind of gotten worse. And the reason why they are more open about it is because they see a legal pathway, a legal framework to be able to institute those beliefs, where previously they didn't because the Supreme Court decision was pro-queer. So the idea that they stop believing that shit, it might be true that queer acceptance has gone up over time, and we should hope that that continues. But it seems like they're trying to fight against that queer acceptance going up still. It doesn't seem like a lot has changed in any major way.
It's just flip parties. For example,
I would like to think that it's a safer world to be LGBTQ, but that would be naive.
Of course.
People are getting murdered for being trans.
That's true.
You know,
Yes.
and gay.
no, they aren't. That's not.
November 11, 2021, from communistforbes.com. Quote, 375 trans people were killed this year. This makes 2021 the deadliest year of violence against gender-diverse people since records began. 1 in 4 of those murdered were killed in their own home. 9 in 10, 96% of those murdered globally were trans women or trans feminine people. Like, even Jubilee's got us.
You know, and gay.
No, they aren't. That's not something that's happening, especially in California where this is being filmed, which is one of the most...
if you want to just ignore reality, TBYS, you can, but Jubilee is literally providing you from Forbes.com, by the way, which is not a left-leaning publication, literal data that suggests that, yes, queer people are the victims of violent crime, and it seems like those victims might be victimized based on the bigoted opinions of their aggressors. If you want to flat out disagree with that data, I guess that's your prerogative, but I don't know, man. That's not a really convincing argument.
Remember, Jubilee is a left-leaning channel, and ironically, they also put up this message here about misinformation.
Middle ground is a social experiment that brings humans with opposing beliefs together. These discussions may contain viewpoints that are the result of misinformation.
The ironic part is that this terminology, misinformation, appears to just be a way of attacking non-establishment talking points, to which a lot of that stuff has turned out to be factually accurate information that big tech was trying to suppress.
The fuck are we talking about, man? Put down the crack pipe, brother. What are you talking about? The establishment, big tech. What are all these buzzwords, man? There is literally a source on the screen telling you that it was literally the deadliest year for trans people, 2021, since records were kept. And you flat out deny that that exists. You're not even going to acknowledge it? Maybe he will. It seems like he might.
Big tech has admitted to that a bunch of times with various rule changes on what counts as misinformation over the past 2 years. But really, the only person who seems to be operating here on misinformation is the Facebook mom who is saying all the pro-establishment ideas.
How is it pro-establishment to be pro-queer? Just because capital owners understand that to put a fucking rainbow logo up for the month of June and to not be aggressively anti-queer is likely to make them more money and face less social pushback, which will cost them money if that happens, doesn't mean that they are pro-queer. In order for them to be pro-queer, they would have to be at the level that they can, using their money through charitable donations to campaigns or organizations that help queer people. That would be one of the ways you would do that. Much the same way that anti-queer conservative capital owners will donate to politicians that are likely to institute anti-queer legislation, if the pro-queer ones were willing to do that, that would probably be more of a signal that they actually give a shit. But simply not wanting the blowback of being anti-queer so that they don't lose money is not enough. And especially not enough to suggest that, like, queer people are pro-establishment or whatever. Or, like, pro-queer people are parroting pro-establishment ideas. It's ludicrous. Like, funnily enough, there was a point in time in history where it was actually detrimental to the public image of a corporation to be pro-queer. So they weren't, right? And if they were likely to get satanic panic type shit happening, like outrage campaigns from bigots, usually conservative, and that would cost them money. So they were silent on the issue, even if they did support it, and they were given more credence to be anti it because it was more likely that, you know, at that time you would be able to get away with it, to be anti-queer. Much the same way that it used to be detrimental to be pro-black as a corporation, to be pro-liberation of black people from oppression. That used to be how this country and the globe, particularly the United States of America, function. If you were against segregation as a corporation at a certain point in time, you were likely to lose business. It was a bad business decision to be vocally pro-ending segregation, right? So a lot of them were silent on it. However, if you were keeping the status quo, which at the time was segregation, if you were pro that, water under the bridge. Who gives a shit, right? Like, the number one objective of any big tech corporation, and all of them, is going to be making a profit, making money. We are currently at a point in society, culturally, where it hurts them to be anti-queer, and it helps them a little bit to change their logo to be a rainbow. So they do that because it is conducive to either keeping profits the same, increasing them, or making sure they don't fall down. Because that's all corporations will ever care about. They don't care about anything else. The ones that do are the ones that donate to anti-gay, anti-queer politicians and campaigns to get them elected, so that those people end up instituting anti-queer legislation, like Disney and the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, right? It's a problem. On the one hand, Disney will be like, oh my god, diversity is our strength, and we accept our queer people, and they'll have like a drag queen or whatever singing a song in an animated format. And then they'll also support and give money to campaigns in Florida for people who supported the Don't Say Gay bill, which is a very vague bill that has led to a lot of books being banned recently in Florida. A lot of books being pulled off the shelves because of how vague that law is, where they don't know if they'll get in trouble for it or not, so they pull them all until the fucking state, the Ministry of Truth, can make sure that the thoughts that are in those books are okay for people and children to look at. Which, frankly, is pretty scary. I don't know if you've read George Orwell's 1984. Kind of spooky. Not a big fan of that. It also makes it more likely, by the way, that any queer teacher who has like a picture of their same-sex spouse on their desk, like a heterosexual teacher might, their opposite gender spouse on their desk, would not get in trouble for, right?
Jubilee tries to save that claim with research that I'm sure Facebook Mom didn't know about by saying there were 375 murders of trans people last year. Problem number one, Jubilee quotes a secondary source. Where's the primary source? How do we know that the Forbes article is accurate? Second, to no surprise, the article states that the vast majority of these crimes were not in the United States. It says,
okay, are we only talking about the USA? Maybe this is just the bubble you live in, TBYS. Now, of course, I understand talking about the United States, generally speaking, if that's where you live, like I do. But it is still the case that this is happening across the globe, and the United States of America is not the only country that exists. Let's see. All right, we got one. From the Williams Institute. This is from October 2nd, 2020. Bit old data. LGBT people nearly 4 times more likely than non-LGBT people to be victims of violent crime. LGBT people are nearly 4 times more likely than non-LGBT people to experience violent victimization, including rape, sexual assault, aggravated or simple assault, according to a new study by the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. In addition, LGBT people are more likely to experience violence both by someone well known to the victim and at the hands of the stranger. Researchers analyzed data from the 2017 National Crime Victimization Survey, the first nationally representative and comprehensive criminal victimization data to include information on the sexual orientation and gender identity of respondents. Results show that in 2017, LGBT people experienced 71.1 victimizations per 1,000 people, compared to 19.2 victimizations per 1,000 people for non-LGBT people. LGBT people had higher rates of serious violence victimization in almost every type of violent crime except robbery, which showed no significant difference between the two. Quote, it is clear that LGBT are at greater risk of violent victimization, but the question is why? One plausible cause is anti-LGBT prejudice at home, work, or school, which would make LGBT people particularly vulnerable to victimization in numerous areas of their everyday life. Key findings. LGBT people 16 plus are nearly 4 times more likely to experience violent victimization compared to non-LGBT people. LGBT people are about 6 times more likely to experience violence by someone who is well known to them and 2.5 times more likely to undergo it at the hands of a stranger. LBT women are 5 times more likely than non-LBT women to experience violent victimization. The risk of violence for LGBT men is more than twice that of non-LGBT men. About half of all victimizations are not reported to police. LGBT people are as likely as non-LGBT people to report violence to police. So that's interesting. It doesn't obviously address the direct point that woke Karen was talking about. But it seems like that LGBTQ people are at a higher risk for violent victimization and are therefore more likely to be, murdered at the hands of that. There's one. Let's see. Is this the same study? We seem to have more pointed data in this one. So here we have, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, violent victimization by sexual orientation and gender identity 2017 to 2020. This report represents data on the rate of violent victimization for persons who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender during the 4-year aggregate period of 2017 to 2020. The report provides demographic characteristics of victims of violent crimes, including sex, race, or Hispanic origin, and age. It also presents data on the types of violent crimes involved and whether victims chose to report the victimization to police. Population estimates for persons aged 16 or older, bisexual orientation, gender identity are also provided. Highlights during 2017 to 2020. The rate of violent victimizations of lesbian or gay persons, 43.5 victimizations per 1,000 persons aged 16 or older, was more than 2 times the rate for straight persons. The rate of violent victimization against transgender persons, 51.5 victimizations per 1,000 aged 16 or older, was 2.5 times more the rate for cisgender persons. 58% of violent victimizations of lesbian or gay persons were reported to police. Domestic violence was 8 times as high among bisexual persons, and more than twice as high among lesbian or gay persons, as it was among straight persons. So there's another one, I suppose. Well, here's one from the Human Rights Campaign. An Epidemic of Violence 2022. Fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people in the United States in 2022. And 2022 was after this was filmed, I believe. Could be wrong about that. Or perhaps at the same time. At least 34 transgender and gender nonconforming people have been killed in the US since the beginning of 2022. So we're just focusing on the USA and not the world. We say at least because the stories detailed in the report are very likely to undercount the number of transgender and gender nonconforming people who were killed in the United States this year. Although advocates, bloggers, and media groups have elevated the epidemic of violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people in the past several years, data collection is often incomplete or unreliable when it comes to violent and fatal crimes against transgender and gender nonconforming people. Some victims' death may go unreported, while others may not be identified as transgender or gender nonconforming because they'll just see the person and sex them based on their genitalia and, move on. So I don't know, man. It seems like there does seem to be an outsized amount of violence directed at the LGBTQIA+ community. And therefore, this claim, for one, is not absurd. And for two, looking at murders throughout the world, also not good that those are happening. So I don't know what point you're trying to make here, man.
It says that most of them were committed in Mexico and South America. Okay. I would love to see the total breakdown, and I bet that next to 0 of them happened in the U.S.
Well, it looks like you were wrong, my friend. Because at an undercounted rate, we've got at least 34 in 2022 alone, which perhaps might have been published after this video. This was 2 months ago, never mind. So it was updated, but it was published before. Yikes. Unfortunate, man.
So her claim is not factually accurate.
You can say, oh, well, next to 0, 34 of that amount is whatever. But you also then look at the rates of victimization for violent crime to queer people in the studies we looked at, and it seems like they are at an increased risk as compared to straight and cis people, which is still a problem, in my opinion. Now, to suggest that the deaths of queer people outside of the United States are somehow less relevant to the conversation is just like callous and kind of anti-empiricist. But I mean, whatever.
To add more context, though, Cindy, the Facebook mom, has a child who is trans.
Okay.
And I think from her perspective, it's like, oh my God, if you're not an ally, then you're here to physically attack my child. This creates a...
Not physically attack, you absolute fucking troglodyte. More people are going to be concerned with the systemic attacks on queer people than the interpersonal ones. If you're on the left anyway. There is a reason that people like TBYS hyper-focus on interpersonal racism or interpersonal anti-queer bigotry or interpersonal misogyny. It's because that's a realm where there is so much context involved that they can kind of twist what's happening and try to make it look like, oh, well, the queer people were asking for it, or, well, look at what she was wearing, and this kind of shit, right? But if you look at the systemic problems that we have diagnosed here, that is a much harder argument to make if you are on the right, as it were, or a centrist, right? It's not that people who have trans children are worried that someone might physically attack their child, because any parent is afraid that their child might come into physical danger from anybody. But more so that they're worried that the state might try to make the lives of trans people worse through anti-queer legislation. That's the issue that they would have.
Fear response, which causes her to behave with so much hostility.
It's a fear response. These emotional women, am I right? Meanwhile, conservatives in fear, name a better duo.
She is definitely the most hostile person. Also, this false belief about crime against trans people leads you to solving the wrong problem. If the problem is suicide and not murder, then your strategy...
We're not talking about suicide and not murder. What are you talking about? We never even brought up in this video, neither TBYS nor the clips of Jubilee have ever brought up suicides when it comes to the queer community. or trans people. Suicides were brought in when we were talking about the handgun-related deaths when it comes to suicide and men being the largest demographic of that. Whereas if you're being charitable, she was talking about the murders as a result of firearms, not suicide. So I guess TBYS is bringing it up, which is kind of not relevant because we're talking about violent crime, not suicide.
Strategy for helping these people needs to be completely different. If
but it's a good thing nobody brought up suicide, so what are you talking about?
Understand the problem, then you're going to come up with the wrong solution.
But you also don't understand the problem because nobody's here talking about suicide. We're talking about violent crime from one person or persons to another. You gotta stick with it. This is not a live recording like I'm doing right now, TBYS. This is a thing that you have recorded offline and published. You have time to try to figure this out. Come on, wake up. Wake up.
On top of that, false beliefs also lead to heavy amounts of intolerance.
My political
Okay, so nobody brought up suicide when it came to trans people, so you're already not having a conversation that anybody else is having because we're talking about violent crime. However, I could be charitable and suggest that this is not the case, but it is more than likely the case that TBYS is bringing up suicide in this case because he seems to think, in the USA, violent crime is not a problem because he suggested that it might be next to zero of queer people or trans people that have been killed because of their marginalized identity and whatnot, which doesn't seem to be factually accurate. So if that's the case, he's probably like, actually, they're all killing themselves. Because, the trans people, 41%, the trans people, they kill themselves. Meanwhile, we have studies to suggest that if a trans person, specifically a trans youth, has access to trans healthcare, as well as a supportive family unit, they are incredibly, by orders of magnitude, less likely to be depressed, and less likely to self-harm, and less likely to attempt to take their own life. The whole 41% thing is a problem of the negative consequences that you get in society for being trans, rather than a problem of being trans itself. Simply being trans, not identifying with the gender you were assigned at birth, is not what is causing people to take their own lives. And one, you're denying reality if you believe that. Two, you're denying actual factual studies and data if you believe that. And three, maybe that's wishful thinking on your part. I'm not too sure. So I'm pretty sure that's what he's doing there. He is gesturing at, it's not queer people getting killed because they're doing it themselves. Well, if we don't have people who have bigoted views against queer people, who then support politicians who institute anti-queer legislation and make the lives of those queer people worse for no reason, then maybe they'll be less likely to take their own life if we're going to have that conversation. But in order to do that, you'd have to be an LGBTQ plus ally. And that's really scary, especially as a centrist. I mean, come on.
Opinions have hurt my relationships with friends and family.
Okay.
What a shock. Cindy has lost friends over this.
Wow, so has one of the conservatives. That's crazy. It's almost like you're less willing to stay friends or family with somebody if they, think that trans people don't exist or shouldn't exist and you have a trans child. Maybe, a reasonable person would be like, that person's probably not a person I want to keep around. I might try to talk to them for a little bit and try to figure out why they think that way and try to move their understanding to one that's closer to reality. But if they aren't moving on that, because oftentimes a lot of conservatives are very dogmatic in their views and are not very malleable at all, shit, I tried my best. I'm just going to move on and not keep this person around because they're kind of an asshole, which is your God-given American right to do, brother. That is your God-given American right.
Now, some of this is unfortunate and unavoidable. I'm sure that over the past few years, most of us have had relationships destroyed that were previously good. But how much of that destruction in Cindy's life was due to her own behavior and intolerance?
Interesting.
So we get this
intolerance. Why don't you tolerate my intolerance? On the one hand, you have a person that, doesn't think trans people exist or should exist. And on the other hand, you have the person who agrees with medical and scientific consensus that trans people do exist and that trans healthcare actually doesn't hurt them. These are not the same, man. And I don't have to be tolerant of the people that don't think that trans people should exist, or that women should be second-class citizens, or that black people should be second-class. I don't have to tolerate that. In fact, it is a good thing to be intolerant to the view of queer people should not have equal rights. Queer people should not be oppressed, or black and brown people should not be oppressed, or that even men on the basis of class, especially if they are white, should not be oppressed by their class status. I am intolerant to those views because those views lead to the harm of people. Perhaps not interpersonally by one person going up to another and punching them, but at a systemic level through legislation when those people go and vote for politicians who push bigoted legislation. But like I say, like, I'm having like a 104 level conversation and TBYS is over here building sentences out of building blocks in kindergarten. Like, we're in a level of difference in conversation that we're never going to be able to meet because he is just not educated enough.
A duality where Cindy first says stuff like this.
I told him, hey, I respect that you think like this. Please respect me.
I think that that is, whether or not we have the same ideas, I think that that is still an admirable quality.
Yeah.
Despite getting looks or feeling like maybe you don't belong, that you're still, you have your convictions.
Yeah.
So I can respect that you're convicted.
Yeah, sure. I can respect that you have a conviction in a belief that as long as you keep it interpersonally, like if you are anti-abortion, but you don't push for restricting the bodily autonomy and individual liberty of people who can give birth at the legislative level, then fine, fuck it. If you don't want to get an abortion yourself, I don't give a shit. Do you? But as soon as you start to try to do harm to countless people through voting for somebody who's going to put in place anti-abortion legislation, then I start to have a problem. Very simple, man.
She implies that she's tolerant of other opinions, but then she says this.
Well, I think we're talking about issues that aren't a matter of opinion,
True.
but a matter of your morality, the value of human lives. I've had to personally block a few people on Facebook, family members.
Oh, wow.
Mostly men that are married to the women in my family. Like, hey, this conversation is really getting personal and hurtful. And if you carry on this way, I'm going to have to block you.
That's such a nice way to phrase it. Be like, yo, I'm not a big fan of these beliefs that you have, and they are causing harm to me and the people around me in whatever capacity. I would like to continue to talk to you, but if you continue to be this way, then I'm going to have to cut you out because I don't need to keep toxic people around me. I think that's fair. And it's a nice way to phrase it, too. You imagine that there's probably more than that soundbite on Jubilee as well, where maybe she tried to talk to those people about why they believe what they believe and try to move them closer to a position that's closer to reality, depending on the issue.
I feel very harassed. Yeah, I'm belittled.
If you're all for everyone having their convictions, then why are you blocking people? I can see if they were legitimately harassing you or being very predatory. However, considering her past behavior and how she describes the situation, I don't think that's what was happening.
But how would you possibly know? Like, what is this argument? Oh, but based on the things that I'm guessing about this interpersonal reaction between two people whom I've never met or spoken to, I'm gonna guess that that wasn't how that was gonna go down, and then that's what I'm gonna base my arguments off of. Like, what kind of a fucking redacted-ass statement is this? What kind of line of argumentation is this? Here I am talking about how systemic issues are the problem here, and if you support anti-queer legislation and you support politicians that are going to push that and institute it to harm people for no reason, I'm gonna have a problem with that. And I have a problem with the systems doing it. I don't give a shit if you yourself are bigoted, as long as you keep it to yourself. But as soon as you start bringing it into other realms that it affects other people, then I start to have a problem. This is the conversation I'm having. This dude is like pontificating with his marble statue about, oh, well, you know, this interpersonal conversation that I was not party to. I think it actually went this way because of my preconceived notions about the person that I very clearly do not like for whatever reason. And this is the argument that I'm gonna, like, what are you talking about, man? How can you pretend to be this objective, critical thinker if this is the level of argumentation that you're going to deliver to your audience?
If she was being harassed, she said, well, I felt harassed, not...
Yeah, because everybody's level of harassment is going to be different. To some people, being called slurs on a daily basis, you get desensitized to it, and it's like, whatever, you know? Like, I don't know, man. There are some crazy people out there. But, like, it's just a matter of what you consider to be harassment. Especially if you're talking about interpersonal relationships with family members. You might be more charitable to family members and not see what they're doing as harassment because of a level of trust that you thought you had for them because they're family members, rather than, like, random-ass strangers. You might be less charitable to random-ass strangers. Maybe she's saying she felt harassed, but isn't clear in saying she was harassed, which you don't know that that's the case, because of that. Like, you don't know. But like I say, we're pontificating over interpersonal engagements that you were not party to. This is nothing to argue about. This is garbage. There's nothing here, man. Also, thank you very much, Caffles, for the raid. I hope you had a good stream. What's going down, everybody? We're currently looking at a TBYS a Think Before You Sleep video, which is a supposed centrist who really hates women, fat people, queer people, and has questions about other minority groups, I'm sure. It's very cool.
Were you actually harassed, or was that just your interpretation? Because
it really depends, doesn't it? It's a good thing that neither of us were party to that conversation, so it doesn't really matter.
I've literally watched woke people in my personal life flip out, call you names, make it personal, and say it's harassment when you simply disagree with them.
But what are you disagreeing on? I mean, I don't think that black and brown people should be systematically oppressed. I don't think that that's good. And if you disagree with me on that, then yeah, I'm probably not gonna give you as much respect. Because then your position would be, well, you do think that that should be the case. Obviously, this is not what we're talking about, but that's the idea, right?
To Steven Crowder on Change My Mind segments quite a number of times. There was literally a girl who called the police on him for making a statement of fact. By the way,
what was the
this
statement
is not the only time.
What was the statement of fact? Do you ever want to deliver any actual points that I can have a contention with, man? Like, you could argue that, oh, well, you're doing the same thing, Conure, by arguing about, like, random anecdotes or whatever. When, one, I'm not. I've brought up more actual factual data than he has in this entire video, and I'm doing this off the cuff, and this is a prepared video on his part. And for two, I'm having to, like, make these obtuse arguments and try to dissect what he's thinking because he is never forthcoming about his beliefs. He is such a fucking coward about what he believes. He will never actually say anything. He will just talk about other people saying things. That's what makes him a centrist? He can't complete statements? I guess so.
Let's go back to that segment on firearms.
I do want to ask you a question. Do you think that women should have the right to bear arms to protect themselves against?
Yeah, I'm not against the right to own guns.
Okay.
The prompt was, do you think owning a gun is a human right?
But do you think?
And I don't agree with that.
Okay. So you aren't for the Second Amendment. Instead of lying.
Huh? What? Well, clearly we're having a more nuanced conversation if she's answering the prompt in one way and having a conversation about something the other way. What do you mean? She said, I'm not against the right to own guns. The prompt was, do you think it's a human right? So a human right and a constitutional right. Yeah, exactly, Lucky Otter. There is a difference there. A constitutional right is one that is given to you through legislation. A human right is usually one that people are, expected to have because of the fact that they're human, like theoretically in an ideal civilized country, food, water, shelter, right? But evidently not. So do you think that owning a firearm is a human right? Is a different question than do you think owning a firearm should be a constitutional right, should be a legislative right?
But do you think?
And I don't agree with that.
Okay, so you aren't for the Second Amendment.
So, like, another non-argument from Think Before You Sleep. Imagine my shock, man.
Instead of lying and gaslighting, why not just say
lying and
that?
gaslighting? She's answering the question. Just because you don't like the answer to the question doesn't mean it's lying and gaslighting. Just because your feelings are hurt because you misunderstand what she's saying doesn't mean it's lying and gaslighting.
Be honest about what you believe instead of pretending that you believe stuff for morality points. Oh, I believe that people have the right to their opinion, and I believe that people have the right to defend themselves. No, you don't. You're just morally grandstanding, and that's...
It's two different conversations, man, and you're having a third one that nobody's having. I don't understand. How is this person real? How is this person allowed to be considered a centrist?
Now, for those of you who didn't see my last video on this subject, Jubilee has actually done the reverse of this debate with conservative parents versus liberal kids. Let's see the difference in how
and that was a shit show. Yeah, go watch my video on that if you want TBYS's video and thoughts on the matter, where he talks about a good apolitical, non-indoctrination way to teach your kid values would be to tax their allowance or some shit like that so that they know that taxes are bad. Like, come on, man. Can we, like, progress past this naive belief that you know what you're talking about?
Parent displays his interest in allowing people to have their opinions.
I read a lot of the tragic stories where family members don't talk to each other anymore. Personally, I think that's sad.
Yeah,
do all my family members vote the same? No. Do we have a pretty good idea of how family members may have voted? Yeah. But we went more of agree to disagree. I'm not going to
Yeah, okay, so we can agree to disagree on things. I agree with that. Depending on what it is. Like, I can agree to disagree with you that peanut butter is like the supreme additive to ice cream, right? As an ingredient. I can agree to disagree, because that doesn't really affect me personally if you believe that. But if you are trying to agree to disagree that, I don't know, queer people shouldn't be oppressed, then no, I'm not going to agree to disagree on that, man. Especially if you're then going to go and vote for somebody that is going to legislate away the rights of queer people. That's not an agree to disagree kind of situation. That is you're voting for actual harm to be done to people that I care about kind of situation. So, like, that's more than likely what's happening.
You know, you decided to vote for somebody that I don't like. Give me a break.
Yeah, but how easy is it for you to say that, dude? Like, depending on your beliefs, like if it is literally, and I don't know if it is for him, but it might be if he's a conservative on this panel. For instance, you don't believe that trans people should have access to medical health care, which a lot of people don't, unfortunately, on the right, and are actually trying to legislate away in a variety of red states. If that is your belief, and there are people in your family that disagree with that, then yeah, they might not want to hang around you anymore. Because they don't want to be around somebody who thinks so little of them or the people they care about, to the point where you're willing to vote for someone who is legislating their rights away. I feel like that's a fairly rational thing that most reasonable people could understand.
Families are special. And we've got too many people, as you've talked about, that don't have them.
I don't think
this is just a lot of flowery rhetoric. Like, he literally, on the one hand, we're gonna talk about how Cindy or whatever is morally grandstanding and saying shit she doesn't actually believe or whatever. And then we're gonna play a clip of this dude morally grandstanding about shit nobody cares about. Oh, I think families are special. And it's a shame people don't have them and people break up over them. And it's a shame that, oh, just because a theoretical person might want to vote for somebody who's legislating the rights of a marginalized group away, you can at least get together and hang out. No, fuck you, bitch. Don't vote for people that are legislating people who care about rights away, man. Easy clap. Very simple. Very simple. Very succinct. Very to the point.
people in Cindy's family are getting a Christmas gift. But not only was that the right way to say that, I also remember this guy being very...
So you like the aesthetics. TBYS, just say it. You like the aesthetics. You like the optics. You like the way that he said what he said, because what he actually said didn't mean anything for the conversation. That's it. So it seems to be the case that it is the liberals or the people further to the left that are more likely to not engage with people who have differing political opinions in these instances, though I don't even know if that's the case. But that seems like it might be the case that then, if that is the case, which TBYS seems to suggest, that the liberals are more likely to cut family members out, that might be because those liberal people, those left-leaning people, have stronger convictions, actually care about their political and moral positions so much to the point where if you're in a position where you are antagonistic against them, especially when it comes to a variety of things that I agree with that seem to be backed up by, studies and data, they might not be likely to want to stay around those people because their convictions are so strong. Whereas conservatives, well, it's water under the bridge, We think that segregation should stay in place between white people and black people. The conservatives think that, and the liberals don't. And, let's agree to disagree, man. When the liberals are literally trying to free people from oppression. Like, you just like the aesthetics, you like the optics, the flowery rhetoric that Jubilee panelist used, and that's what you heard. That's what your little brain enjoyed. Because no arguments were made there.
Very well liked in the comments when the video first came out. It's because he said it like he actually believed it.
No, he said it in a way that appealed to your delicate sensibilities. That's why. And you seem to agree with his ideological predilections.
He said it from the standpoint of, I genuinely do value your opinion, and I don't resent you because it's different from mine. Whereas the Facebook mom says to Nathan, well, you certainly have your opinion, while making a face and acting like she hates it. It's something in particular
that... because what's the opinion we're talking about? Like, we've been through this so many times.
That I've noticed as I've watched a lot of these debates on Jubilee. Maybe it's just my personal bias, but it seems like the yelling, the name-calling, and the hostile behavior almost always comes from someone on the left. Not to say that this stuff is non-existent on the right, but it happens far more frequently on the other side of the political aisle.
Yeah, maybe it's because the other side of the political aisle actually gives a fuck about what they're talking about. Actually has conviction. Actually believes in their viewpoints. And isn't willing to budge on protecting the rights of people. Maybe, I don't know. So basically, this entire video has boiled down to, why can't people just agree to disagree? When the positions are, 1, queer people should have rights, and 2, queer people should not have rights. That's not an agree to disagree position. It might be on an interpersonal level, but as soon as the queer people don't deserve to have rights, people start voting for politicians that legislate those rights away, then you're starting to harm people, right? That's the entire basis of this video, and he just doesn't understand that difference there. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't have the capacity to understand it. He hasn't thought about it, kind of sleepy about it maybe, I don't know.
Remember that the months of rioting in 2020 came from the left.
Oh,
and I think
and what was that about, I wonder? What was that about? Oh, well, it might have been about, wanting to stop black and brown people from being victims of police brutality, which studies have shown seems to be that police brutality disproportionately affects them. So we're going to try to protest in order to change that. It's a scary thought, right? To try to stop police from brutalizing black and brown people. Crazy things coming out here. Taking a brave stance here. Also, 93% of the BLM protests in 2020 were peaceful. We have the direct link. New report. There you go. So this is from the ACLED. Introduction. The United States is at a heightened risk of political violence and instability going into the 2020 general election. So this is published before then. Mass shootings hit a record high last year, violent hate crimes are on the rise, and police killings continued unabated at 2.5 times the rate for black men as for white men. The COVID-19 pandemic has killed well over 180,000 people and disrupted the economy, while George Floyd's death in police custody has sparked a massive wave of protests across the country. Those protests trying to stop the 2.5 times rate of black men being killed by police and also stop all people from being killed by police because, funnily enough, BLM has protested against white people being brutalized by the cops before. It has happened. I know woke conservatives don't want you to know that, but it has. The U.S. Crisis Monitor, a joint project between the ACLED and the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University, collects real-time data on the trends in order to provide timely analysis and resources to support civil society efforts to track, prevent, and mitigate the risk of political violence in America. With supplemental data collection extending coverage back to the week of Floyd's killing in May, the dataset now encompasses the latest phase of the Black Lives Matter movement, growing unrest related to the health crisis and politically motivated violence ahead of the November general election. These data reveal that the United States is in crisis and it faces a multitude of concurrent overlapping risks, and police abuse and racial justice to pandemic-related unrest and beyond, all exacerbated by increasing polarization. This report maps these trends with a view toward the upcoming election when these intersecting risks are likely to intensify. So here we go. Are you ready? An overwhelmingly peaceful movement. The vast majority of demonstration events associated with the BLM movement are non-violent, see map below. In more than 93% of all demonstrations connected to the movement, demonstrators have not engaged in violence or destructive activity. Peaceful protests are reported in over 2,400 distinct locations around the country. Violent demonstrations, meanwhile, have been limited to fewer than 220 locations, under 10% of the areas that experience peaceful protests. In many urban areas like Portland, Oregon, for example, which has seen sustained unrest since Floyd's killing, violent demonstrations are largely confined to specific blocks rather than dispersed throughout the city. And we have a little addendum here. Violent demonstrations refer to demonstration events in which the demonstrators themselves engage in violently disruptive and or destructive acts targeting other individuals, property, businesses, other rioting groups, or armed actors. Such demonstrations can involve engagement in violence, e.g. clashes with police, vandalism, e.g. property destruction, looting, roadblocking, using barricades, burning tires, and other materials, amongst others. This category also includes events where violence may have been initially instigated by police or other actors engaging demonstrators associated with the BLM movement. So, this category may also include events where the police initially instigate it, which we've seen a lot of footage to support, and now the data from the study is also supporting, as well as other actors engaging demonstrators associated with the BLM movement. Meaning the Proud Boys, 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, whatever counter-protesters are out there seeking to cause conflict to create media storms around the so-called violence where they strategically clip out the fact that they started it, which has happened a lot. That is all to say that this is a very charitable definition of violent demonstrations. 93%, which includes the police and counter-protesters counter-protesting the BLM protesters instigating the violence. 93% are non-violent. If you were to remove the police starting it, or other actors that are counter to BLM starting it, then you might get higher than 93%. It is a charitable estimate. Yet, despite data indicating that demonstrations associated with the BLM movement are overwhelmingly peaceful, one recent poll suggested that 42% of respondents believe, quote, most protesters associated with the BLM movement are trying to incite violence or destroy property, from 538. This is in line with the Civics tracking poll, which finds that, quote, net approval for the Black Lives Matter movement peaked back in June 3rd, the week following the killing of George Floyd, when riots first began to be reported, and has fallen sharply since. which is to suggest that even though 93% of these demonstrations, at a charitable estimate, have been peaceful, the propaganda pushed by the right-wing media like Tucker Carlson, like Ben Shapiro, like Matt Walsh, like Candace Owens, all these people pushing this propaganda that, oh my god, BLM is burning down cities because of the death of George Floyd or whatever, 93% at a charitable estimate have been peaceful, but the people suggesting that they haven't been, that, quote, most protesters associated with BLM are trying to incite violence or destroy property, is because of the propaganda. It's the propaganda, stupid. There you go. We got data, we got propaganda. Conservatives are using propaganda. Here I am countering that with data. Take that as you will. If you want to continue to believe the anecdotes that we're hearing from Think Before You Sleep, and feel free. But I mean, that is a tough argument to make.
Remember that the months of rioting in 2020 came from the left.
And
I think quite a lot of that has to do with political leaders on the left actively encouraging violence in the disguise of morality.
What? Literally every second word out of the lips of the majority of the people on the screen, if not all of them, have been supportive of police, saying we need to fund them more, supporting funding them more. Like, every single second word out of these people's lips is, oh, people shouldn't be violent. The rioting is bad. Property destruction is bad, right? They're just not so deluded as to disagree with the study that suggests that 93% of them are nonviolent, at a charitable estimate. Two right-wingers. But okay.
None of this stuff is moral. Trying to force someone to agree with you by raising your voice or calling them names is not moral.
But I will say, it's also not moral to try to convince somebody to agree with your beliefs by literally never stating your own opinion and just pontificating on hypotheticals about potential interpersonal relationships that people might have on a Jubilee panel. That might be the problem, I think, as well.
Saying someone is a bad person simply because you disagree with them is not moral. Demonizing an entire group of people for the way they were born because a few people did bad things is not moral. Using violence to get your...
Okay. So I guess you could also say that that's the case for people who demonize, like, all black people, for instance, about the so-called violence that happens in anti-police brutality protests because a few bad people did some bad things, even though 93% of them are overwhelmingly peaceful. But I don't know that we're willing to do that, considering...
Using violence to get your way is not moral. Do you know what is moral? Listening...
Using violence to get your way. Any, violence that happened in the 7% that were considered violent in the study would have been in response to the violence that the police are subjecting black and brown people at disproportionate rates to, right? It's like, do you think that people trying to end segregation, being violent against systems like police stations, for instance, would have been immoral? The police that are literally there to keep segregation in place and enforce segregationist laws? Because then you might be, logically extending from that to supporting segregation, which I don't think you want to do. We could go further back and talk about slavery as well. It's the same thing. Like, is a slave burning down the slave master's house immoral if the slave is subject to all manner of violence for being dehumanized and enslaved? I don't know, man. It might be difficult for centrists to come to that conclusion, but I can tell you with my chest that no, I don't think segregation is good. I don't think slavery was good, and I think any violence to end the ills of slavery, any violence to end segregation, I'm willing to give a little bit of a pass. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. Bit of a hot take.
One of the things that you learn as a content creator, especially as your voice starts reaching more people and more people criticize you, is to take a step back in your convictions a little bit. I have found quite a bit that when I'm more reserved in my opinion, my information gets more accurate. Versus this sort of low...
But this entire video has not been good proof of that, my man. You might need to do a little bit more work on that one. If this is you reserved, maybe you need to get even more reserved.
Resolution description that you get from Cindy. She's operating with a crappy webcam in 144p while she thinks she's at 1080p.
What are we
Her
talking
vision
about,
of the problem isn't really clear. She knows that trans people have problems, but she can't see well enough to identify the correct one.
So the correct one he's talking about here when trans people have problems is suicidality, which he is actively, whether he knows it or not, working to increase the percentage of.
Therefore, there is no way she could ever provide a correct solution, which means all she can do is shout her factually incorrect opinion at people. When you're forming
this entire video has just been a mirror for Think Before You Sleep.
Opinions or trying to find solutions to a problem, you want as clear of an image as possible. You get that clear image by listening, being willing to be wrong, and by investigation.
What's cool about that is that I do listen, I am willing to be wrong, and I do investigate, and you're still a fucking idiot. I'm sorry. You're actually still dumb. You're still wrong. And I've done all those things. So maybe I'm just, like more equipped. I don't know. And I'm willing to have fun with it. I don't have to be so reserved.
The goal is not to be right all the time. The goal is to have
The goal is not to be right all the time? What? I would say that it's okay to be wrong every now and again, as long as you understand that you're wrong and you try to take steps to fix that. But I would like to try to be right all the time if I could. But I mean, I guess you have to kind of get used to being wrong sometimes when you're thinking before you sleep, you know?
Better understanding of the problem so you can provide the best solution. Anyway, thanks for watching. Follow me on Twitter and
what a fucking garbage video. Let's look at these comments. Let's go. Encouraging your child to be trans should be child abuse. So this is in reference to Cindy earlier in the video who said that she had a trans child. Nowhere in any of her commentary that at least the clip showed, because we know these people didn't watch the original Jubilee video. That's just a selectively, picked clips from TBYS. Never did she say that she was encouraging her kid to be trans. She was just accepting her kid as trans and allowing her kid to live as trans, which means going through the medical and mental health professionals to receive the treatments that is necessary, which is puberty blockers if they're young enough to try to figure it out, and then HRT, or understanding they're not trans and moving on. So this idea that people are encouraging their children to be trans is not happening. We've seen no data to suggest it does. However, we do have data to suggest that puberty blockers are virtually zero negative side effects and are actually very helpful. It's the standard of care for a reason, and that HRT is overwhelmingly beneficial to trans people who get it. So if you want to go with the data here, like TBYS seems to suggest he does, and this is not a comment you would be happy seeing in your comment section. I don't know how you could watch this video and be like, Cindy is a perfect example of the NPC meme IRL, because we've gotten no actual arguments here. TBYS actually hasn't brought up very many of his own opinions. He's only talked about what other people are talking about, which is pretty NPC behavior to me. It's like drama at that point. That's the level we're at. It's like reality TV drama shit. Celebrity drama shit. Cindy strikes me as someone who spends every possible waking moment on social media, from the person's video that they were watching, where we're literally only talking about online shit. If you really believe that trans people in America, like next to zero trans people in America, are victims of violent crime or killed, then clearly you're not actually engaging with, reality. You're just looking at shit online. Looking at propaganda. This dude has had the biggest impact on my critical thinking growth. He literally never made an argument. He never critically thought about anything. That's sad, man. Critical support for Phil Kirby, dude. Hopefully you find a better role model. That's depressing. Whenever I hear the term trans kid, I automatically look at the parents, and almost every time you'll find a parent looking for attention. The only way you get a trans kid is if the adult puts the idea in young children. Not actually true. We've seen no data to suggest this. Also, it seems like, unfortunately, in our society, the majority of the time you hear the term trans kid, it's usually going to be a kid that is in a position where they are subject to abuse or violence from their bigoted parents, which happens a lot. The homelessness rate for LGBTQIA youth is very high, disproportionately so, because of their bigoted parents not accepting them and kicking them out of the house, which is a violent action to do. Not even to mention the mental or physical abuse that they might be subject to as well. Now, a lot of the time, these people be like, oh, these parents are looking for attention. It's probably because the parents are looking for attention in the way that they're trying to be advocates for allowing queer people to exist without being oppressed, which would include any queer youth that may happen to exist. Which, unfortunately, the woke conservatives don't want you to know this because it hurts their feelings. They do. People can be trans and understand that at a young age. We have a lot of people that's been the case for, no matter how much you want to close your ears and pretend it doesn't happen. Karen came very close to saying what she actually believes. Let me help her out. Women have the right to keep and bear arms. Men don't. The only way you hear her statement where she disagrees that owning a firearm is a human right, but agrees that owning a firearm is a constitutional right, or should be a constitutional right even, is if you're so ready and willing and predisposed to never giving women any kind of respect or charitability in conversation. Ever. Because in no way could you ever possibly come to that conclusion as a reasonable and rational person. She's talking about two different kinds of rights. Human rights and legal rights. They're different things. Anyway. Well, I mean, that's about as much as you would expect. Anyway, hope you had fun here. I know that the TBYS dick riders are probably going to be in the comments, so have fun in that if you're in my comment section. Good luck out there. Know that a lot of these people probably don't know what they're talking about and also are probably not acting in good faith. However, you might find some hidden gems here and there that are. Have fun with that. And yeah, I guess have a good day. This video is called as longtime community member and live stream chatter Rumble Ball. Really appreciate the continued engagement with the community. Keep it up. If you'd like to be a Conure Callout, all you gotta do is follow me on Twitter at ConureCC, retweet my links when they go live. Remember to subscribe to the channel, put on notifications on with the bell. Appreciate that. Hit the fucking like button. Comment something down below about how centrism is fake.
Chugging.
And keep on chugging.